session. This is a session that is going to reflect on a book. I don't know if everybody can see this, The Sciences Settlement, that was written by one of our panelists, Barry Goldman. Barry is an arbitrator, a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators from Michigan. As well, we have Christopher Albertyn from Toronto by way of South Africa, and we have Jules Bloch, presently in Victoria, but Jules is an Ontario arbitrator. And so the subtitle of this book is Ideas for Negotiators. And you are going to hear from Barry, Jules, and Christopher about ideas for negotiators. And we are going to have some polls in connection with this small session. So you will be able to participate that way. And as well, we've got a small audience, so we are going to take questions as we go along. So if you want to ask questions in the chat or raise your hands, we're a small group, so we can do this fairly informally. Barry, take it away.
Thanks. The idea for the whole book and for this session is that people make irrational decisions, but they don't make randomly irrational decisions. The bad decisions and the bad judgments that we make are predictable in certain ways. And because they're predictable, they can be manipulated. Let me give an example. The simplest way is to start with an example. If I say, how long will it take to drive from Toronto to Miami? You'll give me an answer. If I ask, how long will it take to drive from Miami to Toronto, I'll get a different answer. Why? Well, because driving from Miami to Toronto, you have to drive up, right? And of course, it takes more energy and it takes longer and it costs more to drive up. If you do this, ask this question enough time, you'll get that peculiar, irrational silliness a lot. And lots of the decisions we make and the judgments we make are influenced in these peculiar ways and come up with these peculiar results. So we've got 6 of these kinds of ideas, general ideas, errors in, predictable errors in judgment and decision making. I'm going to introduce each of them, talk about them a little bit, and then my colleagues, Chris and Jules, are going to talk about how those ideas appear at the table where we're trying to settle lawsuits, and how they can be used to help people try to settle. So the first one we've got in mind is anchoring. Let's use as an example the same trip from Toronto to Miami. If I say how many miles is it from Toronto to Miami, and I ask you to guess, I'll get some kind of an answer. I'll get a distribution of answers, right? But before I ask you that question, I ask you another question, I can influence the answer that you give me. For instance, if I say, is the distance from Toronto to Miami more or less than 100 miles? And then I say, okay, you say it's more than 100 miles. Yes, it is. How far is it? And I'll get a distribution of answers. And if I ask the question first, is it more or less from Toronto to Miami, is it more or less than 10,000 miles? You'll say less. And I say, okay, how far is it from Toronto to Miami? I'll get a distribution of answers, and they will be much, much more. Why? It's a principle called anchoring, and it's just a feature of the way we make judgments and the way we make decisions. The man is asking me for a number. I need to come up with a number. What'll it be? And the way it works is that we just reach into our memory and grab the last entered number and adjust from there. So if the last entered number is 10, we adjust up from 10. And if the last entered number in the memory was 10,000, we adjust down from there. And the point is, we tend not to adjust enough. We under adjust. Anchors are overweighted. One more point before I kick it to my other panelists. That is this. In addition to giving you the sort of the order of magnitude of an answer, I can anchor in your mind the units that we're going to use for discussion. I say, how far is it from Toronto to Miami in tanks of gas, in hours on the road, in stops? How many stops would you have to? How much would it cost to drive from Toronto? I can determine by the way I frame the question, the order of magnitude you're going to give me in the answer to some degree, and the units that you're going to use that you're going to use to answer me. Gentlemen.
Okay. So to pick up on what Barry is saying, I'm going to focus on the question of how can a mediator use anchoring as part of the effort to settle a case? What's the ways in which a mediator can do it? And one obviously is everybody comes in with some anchors on their case. So let's say we've got a termination case and the parties agree they're going to talk about a buyout and how much money is the individual employee going to get to leave their employment. Let's say it's a relatively short service employee, and the union will have some anchor in mind when they start talking, and the employer will have a very different, much lower anchor in mind when they start talking. So the mediator can simply just get proposals from the one, from the other, and gradually move them closer over the time. To speed up the process a bit, it is possible too for the mediator to create your own anchors. So you could say, so look, this is going to settle, I'm assuming, somewhere between $6,000 and $12,000. Is that the sort of area we're talking about? Now, both sides will react badly to that. Both sides will say, the employer will say, no, we're not thinking of anything above we're under $5,000, meaning they're probably at $5,000. And the employers and the union's going to say, no, we're thinking $20,000, somewhere there. But you've put out the anchors of those figures that you've mentioned. So somewhere the idea has been projected, maybe the settlement is in that area between $6,000 and $12,000 or $8,000 and $12,000, so that you've tried to bring them together, and they then, when they go back to their rooms and talk to their parties, it's in play now, these numbers, which were not numbers that were in play before.
Well, so I'm going to talk about removing anchors. Chris is talking about trying to create anchors in a mediation. I'm going to talk about how disruptive, for a second anyway, how disruptive it is to remove anchors. And in interest bargaining, there are some very mature relationships who have decided to have joint costing. So proposals are costed by both sides in the sense of they retain somebody to do the costing of the proposals. So one way for one side or the other to shake up the interest bargaining is to refuse to participate in the joint costing. So you no longer have agreed to anchors. And then you're into what most of us do or have done is trying to figure out proposals, and both sides have their own costing on proposals. And as the mediator or the interest arbitrator, you're trying to create your own decision about that. Another interesting, and this isn't a labor or employment matter, but just to open it up to think about, is for years climate scientists have been telling us, and I think it's the majority or the vast majority, that there's a climate problem. There's a greenhouse gas problem. There's a whole ozone problem. In the United States, President Trump basically told the government scientists they can no longer release information about that. So there's a situation where there wasn't really a debate about climate, and now there is again. So there's the example of where there are anchors, where there is information, where it's information that's accepted by both parties or multi-parties. And when you take away the anchors, you create debates. You create stresses in the negotiation or the interest arbitration in the example I used before. So we live with anchors every day. One last point about anchors. My favorite anchor, of course, being an arbitrator, is precedent. And precedent actually anchors us as arbitrators into deciding cases based on what someone previously has decided. It informs our point of view. But it also limits creativity. Because we have accepted precedent as anchors, when someone raises an argument that has no backup in precedent, that argument doesn't have the same weight as the same argument if it's been accepted before by other arbitrators. And there's a problem with that. And that's probably why new law doesn't happen that often, because we are all stilted in in the way we look at a problem. For arbitration, I mean.
Thanks, Jules. And just in relation to the anchoring point, to follow up on precedent, Chris's point about the mediator coming in and saying, this is what I think the parameters of the deal are, that will, of course, be based on precedent, right? Chris will have made an assessment as to the value of the case based on other cases. So not only is the anchor coming from the arbitrator as I guess, an objective statement of the parameters, there's some basis to it. And in terms of settlement, that's why, of course, the assessment comment of the arbitrator is so valuable. So next concept then, reactive devaluation.
Sure. Or do you want to see if there are any questions about anchoring?
Any questions about anchoring? Pretty straightforward concept, I think.
The next one's reactive devaluation, and it works like this. People, when sides are in conflict, anything proposed by the other side must be bad. After all, they're on the other side. So there's a great experiment that's been done many times on this subject. I have two proposals. Here they are. This is the proposal proposed by the Democrats, and this is the one proposed by the Republicans. What do you think? Take your time, look at it. And of course, I don't have to look at it very carefully. I know which tribe I'm a member of. I know which team I'm on. I know that in my personal case, the Republican plan is unacceptable. It's bad. It's a terrible plan. It has to be. It's proposed by Republicans. So what they do in the experiment is they just switch the proposals, put a different heading on the top of the page, and hand them to another, randomly selected group of participants, and they get exactly the same reaction. If I read the proposal from the Republicans and it looks good, I don't say, oh, the Republicans have proposed something good. I say it must be a trick, because they're on the other side. They're not going to make I know it's a trick. Or at least I know it doesn't compare with how wonderful the proposal from the people on my tribe must be. That's reactive devaluation. I automatically devalue any proposal that comes from the bad people on the other side, because they're bad people and they're on the other side. Gentlemen.
I guess I'm going first. So I'm going to think about something that's a historic and a timeline to look at how things changed on reactive devaluation. I see Pierre Moreau, I see Rick Charney, John Budd, Patrick Kelly, all people who are basically the same vintage as I am. Sorry, Pierre, you look so much younger. So we remember the original debates for NAFTA and how the trade union movement was just so anti-NAFTA and was anti partially because the Americans and the government at the time was a conservative government, and they were just anti. And we watched over the years as, in fact, Canada and the trade union movement in Canada did quite well under NAFTA. So when they started talking about the trilateral agreement, I don't know what it's called now. I don't even know if it's been finally. I don't think Canada has voted it in, or maybe the states haven't. But the trade union movement were all for protecting NAFTA. The same document, the same words that they were so against. Now, this can be used, we're going to talk about status quo as a concept as well very soon, but it matters who's trying to change things. And it'd be interesting if Canada had wanted to change NAFTA and how the trade union movement would have reacted to that. Again, who says things in a mediation, how you look at a mediation in terms of analysis of positions, all that matters. And obviously positions are devalued from when they're uttered by people you don't respect or don't think are right.
Okay, so how do you as a mediator, how do you deal with that issue? How do you deal with reactive devaluation? I think one of the methods, I'm sure there are others, is to try to develop a neutral concept. So rather than conveying proposals, employer said this, they suggesting this as a possible solution, or the union said this as a possible solution, which invokes the kinds of suspicions that Barry and Jules have spoken of. Instead of that, maybe you develop an idea. An idea develops. Obviously, it comes from the parties and from what the parties have told you as a mediator, but it's a neutral idea. What about this? What if we were to try this? So all of a sudden, it comes out as a proposal of the mediator. It may very well even explicitly have come from one of the counsel, say, of one of the parties. But it's agreed that it'll be presented to the parties as the mediator's idea. This is something we can all work on as a basis for talking. So that's a way of trying to break the reactive. And I mean, the nature of the relationship is important in this. In good relationships, this is less a factor. But in highly suspicious relationships, it is an important issue to address in a mediation.
Any questions about that concept or comments about that concept?
Can I add something to it, which I just thought of now? It's listening to Chris speak with his wonderful South African accent. Right away, you believe everything he says. Listening to me speak with my my Canadian or Montreal inflected English, you wonder about if anything I'm saying makes sense. But it's really important to look at who's saying it and getting below to the actual nuts and bolts of what is being said. And as a mediator, using that to present the position, as Chris pointed out, is, I think, a very good technique.
Any comments from viewers?
Susan, can I?
Go ahead, Rick.
I have a question, and then I have two questions. One more specific, one more general. Number one, given this phenomenon, would it make sense in some cases to, if you have different teams, you have a union team, you have an employer team, in determining who might initiate the proposal, other than the mediator herself or himself, to what extent is that given careful thought by practitioner mediators? That's question one. And question two, more for Barry. His report on tribal instincts doesn't surprise me, but what surprises me Is it like 100% correlation? Like surely within the tribes, there are people who are more critical and able to, and may not always vote for their tribe's proposal, whether it be a political plank or a labor settlement or some other thing. I'm just curious, is it that? It can't be 100% correlation, but I'd be curious. It's a more general sociological question.
Who wants to answer the first question? Chris or Jules?
So on the first one, Rick, I think it's often useful to work out where the proposal is going to come from. I mean, so let's say you start with council and there's a reasonably cooperative relationship with the council, and the council are themselves looking to help in the process of settlement. One of the items you might discuss is, where's the first proposal going to come from and how's it going to be made? Is it an idea that's coming from the mediator, or should we start, I mean, typically on money, it's often a good idea to start with the employer, because if it starts with the individual grievor, who's the least experienced people in doing the person in doing these settlements, comes in with their own vision from way outside of, what they've read in newspapers, and somebody spilled coffee on somebody in Florida and got 3 million, that kind of stuff. So that's the wrong place to start on a money proposal. So that, I think, is one of the issues you would plan, and whether it's, and the issue of, the reactive devaluation might be a consideration in where that first proposal comes from for the resettlement.
Thanks, Chris. Do you want to deal with Rick's?
I just wanted to do Chris's thing. I disagree with Chris in this sense. I actually think putting on the table the absurd proposal of the griever first is actually helpful to me, because the employer will then react with an equally low proposal. It's been my experience. And then you could start taking apart the griever's anchoring after they've put on the table the high number. I disagree with Chris, not because he's right or wrong, but this is just not the way I usually do this. The second thing I want to say is, it's funny when you say that. The second thing I want to say, why don't you just say it? But it's clear to me that I try to wait for a few passes before I use the approach of, here's my idea. Because if people can solve the problem by passing back and forth in a way that doesn't involve my suggestion, that actually gives me more clout in the mediation if it falls apart. And so I can sew it back together. And again, that's just been my experience.
Thanks, Jules. Barry, do you want to now respond to Rick's second question?
Second question. Nothing having to do with human beings is always or never or everybody. But it gives you a little edge. If you know a little bit, it's likely that this is going to influence this decision. If I ask you the Toronto-Miami question one way or the other, some people will have the same answer in both directions, but it's gonna have an effect on enough people's and enough predictable irrationality so that it can make the difference between a settlement and no settlement, for instance. It can give you that edge.
Thank you, Barry. So we're on, I think, to our next concept, the endowment effect.
On to our next concept, and this time we thought we would do an experiment first and talk about it second. So you will, excuse me, I got smoked too many breakfast cigars this morning. You've all got a button at the bottom of your screen that says participants. And if you click the participant button, you can see everybody who is in this talk. Leaving out the panel, what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4,
10.
5, 6, 7, 8. 8 people? Is that right?
We've got 10.
We've got 15 participants.
We've got 10
total,
total.
so we should have 10 people.
10 people.
In the audience.
Okay, so if you look, I think do they always appear in the same order on everybody's screen?
No.
No.
I think you just have to call out names, Barry.
Okay. names. And you want the first 5 names on my screen are as follows after the panel. Jonathan, Linda, Patricia, Patrick, Pierre. You are the lucky recipients of a T-shirt. We're going to give you a T-shirt, a sweatshirt, for your participation here today. Can we get a picture of that sweatshirt up on the screen? There it is. We have an imaginary virtual sweatshirt for half of our participants this afternoon. Congratulations. Free. It's in your size, by the way. It automatically fits everyone. It's a magic virtual sweatshirt. And it's yours. But we didn't have enough of them. So the other half of you, I'm sorry, the next 5 participants, if I didn't call your name, you didn't get a T-shirt. Sorry, we didn't have enough. But we can fix that by the magic of the market. So we're going to ask you a question. Actually, the 2 questions will appear on the screen in a second. And one of them is going to say, I have a T-shirt. I'm a seller. I can sell my T-shirt. And you're going to enter, if you're the seller. That's the first 5 people whose names I named. You are sellers. You can sell your T-shirt if you want. And there's a series of prices. What's the lowest price you would accept to sell that T-shirt? There you are. There's the poll. And if you're not a seller, say, I'm not a seller. We have to have everybody answer both questions for some technical reason. And if you don't have a T-shirt, you're a buyer. And then we're asking you the same question, or the equivalent question. What's the greatest amount of money you would pay to buy one? And the theory is, of course, that a market is efficient and the sweatshirts will go to the people who want them, and people will, this was a random distribution, a random selection. We have no reason to think that the first 5 people like T-shirts more than the second 5. So it should wash, it should even out, and we'll be able to figure out what these things are worth. So go ahead. If I named your first name, tell me how much you would accept to sell your sweatshirt, and if you're a buyer, how much would you be willing to pay to buy it? Let me give you a few seconds to answer this question.
We have a couple more people that haven't voted, 6 votes in so far.
We need some buyers to actually make their proposal.
Does that mean we just lost 6 people?
There are 7 votes in. So I guess a couple of people haven't voted yet.
Buyers have, we've only got 2 buyers participate so far.
We have some, so perhaps we move on. Last chance for buyers.
I mean, for sellers, sorry, it's the sellers who we're short of.
Sorry, I've already clicked the end poll.
That's fine.
Do you want me to share the results to the audience now?
No, let's not share it, and then we can lie about them.
Okay.
Okay, I don't think it's helpful. It's not going to make the point.
No.
It's not going to make the point. We'll just talk about how it works if you get, all right. You can, yeah, sure, you can show the answers we got. But we have, our participants are too sophisticated and there's too few of you. Let me just talk about what ordinarily happens when you have unsophisticated audience and a large enough a large enough N for it to make some sense, is that people who pretend to own this virtual sweatshirt value it more than people who pretend not to own it. And what we typically see, and what Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for learning, for discovering, is the endowment effect, that people value what belongs to them, even if it's an imaginary thing and you've only pretended that it belonged to you for a few seconds. What we typically see in this experiment, and did not see just now, is that sellers, people who got the thing, value it roughly at twice the amount that people who did not get the thing are willing to pay to buy it. We didn't see that in this case, but the idea of the endowment effect is pretty robust and pretty well established. What belongs to me is good, and I should keep it. It's valuable. What doesn't belong to me, not nearly as valuable, and not nearly as important. I'll give another example, just because. If I say, look, you had a long lost uncle, and he died and left you a portfolio of stocks. He left you a portfolio of stocks, but you get one free trade. You can move those stocks around and buy anything else you want, or you can leave it where you got it. People, it doesn't matter what they got, they will leave it there. In general, as a rule, often, to a statistically significant extent, leave it where it is. Because it's mine, and it looks like this. So even if I'm a high risk investor, if I inherit a low risk portfolio, I'm going to leave it where it is, and I'm going to be resistant to changing it because of the endowment effect. Gentlemen.
I was thinking, okay, so it's an interesting concept in the sense of believing what you have is better than what other people have. You get ownership of this, even though you don't really know the cost. You don't really know what you have. And in a bargaining context, and in negotiating and mediating collective agreements, it always surprises me what some parties ask for in a context where what they're asking for might be less in terms of cost or necessity than other things they're not asking for. Now, I realize with trade unions, a lot of that is people develop their asks from the floor, or because trade unions are a democracy. So a lot of the requests come directly from the members of the trade union. And in that context, some of the things they're asking for respond to a lot of the concepts that are being raised. An endowment effect is they believe that something they want might be worth more than the ask. Then they could have other things that are worth more, but they want this particular option. So I mean, I think that's interesting.
One example is the idea behind interest-based bargaining is really an idea of jettisoning endowment. If you think of normal bargaining, where you have the union pass one, employer pass 1, 2, 3, and they modifying their demands as they go along, there's an endowment effect in the sense that what they put forward initially is that's their possession that they want to accomplish in bargaining. And so in a sense, the process of bargaining is a series of disappointments as proposals fall off the table. I mean, some satisfaction that your proposal is accepted, but a series of disappointments until you come to an eventual agreement. The idea of the interest-based bargaining is that you are looking at concepts of what needs to be addressed without a position that you want particularly at the start, without a position that you're endowed in a sense, that it has become a possession of yours. So that makes for more flexibility and capacity to move on the ideas and come to an agreement on the ideas, and then after that, what language is required to be developed can be developed. There's less, you're not giving up anything really when you're coming to develop the language. The other area where it appears, I think, is sometimes, and this happens more in claims of personal harm, where somebody, for argument's sake, has been harassed or for a long time, or has felt very unhappy at work for a long time over an issue. And now you're coming to try and resolve how that issue is going to be dealt with and solved. And in a way, some people have lived that experience of fighting their grievance for a very long time. It's become a real part of their lives. And it's not always easy. I mean, one of the issues that I think one needs to deal with in mediating and solving that problem is to deal with the loss the person will feel when this is no longer a part of their lives. This belief of, you know, I'm fighting to get this right, I'm fighting to get this right, and I'm going to fix this. And they've been with it for years, feeling about this feeling of being disgruntled and being unhappy and being maltreated. And now you're providing a solution, or the parties are providing a solution, and they've got to dispense with those feelings that have been built up over a long period. I think that is an endowment effect that one needs to address as part of the resolution.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions or comments about that before we move on to the next one?
I just want to add a way around the endowment effect. And the best example I can think of is in bargaining. Because at the end of the day, the employer and the trade union have a final answer. And are they prepared to lock somebody out for this proposal, or are they prepared to go on strike for this, for not having this proposal? And that quickly sets a sense of reality and forces parties to deeply evaluate the proposal and whether it is worth going to the wall for. So that is a reality check on things like the endowment effect.
Thank you, Jules. Any comments from the audience? If not, we will move on to the next concept, biased punctuation of conflict. Barry?
Biased punctuation of conflict. When I do something that harms you, it's not because I'm a bad person. I'm not a bad person. I'm a lovely person. You are a bad person, and you deserved it. When I explained the history of our dispute, it's almost inevitable that I'm going to start by saying the other guy started it. His aggression is unprovoked aggression. My retaliation is retaliation. And the people on the other side don't see it that way. Where I see a period, they see a comma. Where I see a comma, they see a period. That wasn't an unprovoked attack. That was a retaliation for something you did previously. I just read this morning, maybe you did too, there's this guy threw a strange six-year-old boy. He comes up to an unknown stranger six-year-old boy and throws him off a 10-story building. And they said, why did you randomly pick this 6-year-old boy and throw him off this? What could be more of an unprovoked act of unprovoked aggression. And he said, I needed to make a point. It was the only way I could do it. People have been ignoring me. I've been telling them I got this mental illness. I need to be in a hospital, and they haven't been paying attention. And I needed to get their attention. It was the only way I could do it. I was provoked. This is just the nature of the way we talk to ourselves. We justify our actions, no matter what our actions are, as a perfectly rational response to the situation we've been placed in through no fault of our own. That's biased punctuation of conflict. I had no choice. I had to do that, whatever horrible thing I did. Gentlemen.
So I want to think about how to deal with that, because that comes across often in what we do. And for those of you who read a lot of Fisher and Urey, they came up with this idea of partisan perception, which is trying to understand the other side by putting yourself in the shoes of the other side. And I spend a lot of time during my day trying to understand the conflict from the perspective of putting myself in the shoes of one side and then the other side. First of all, that helps to generate options that will probably be acceptable to both sides, but it really deals with trying to understand their bias, and the conflict and how they're perceiving the conflict. Because if you can understand how someone is perceiving the conflict, you can then figure out solutions to the conflict that will address both the perception and the reality of the conflict.
Chris?
Yeah, this idea is really the idea that my pain is worse than your pain, basically. And how do you stop that? How do you and it sort of originates in blame, that and the focus on blame. So I suppose in a mediation, the idea would be to look forwards rather than looking to what happened, and try and move the parties off who actually was to blame for this, or who exactly was to blame, or the extent of blame, and let's work out where we want to go forwards. How would we like the situation to be resolved from now on, and how would we like to work together, leaving aside what happened? I mean, we need to obviously to deal with what happened, but we don't actually need to focus on the blame. Let's think about what the solution looks like, and then that makes it much easier to deal with what happened with the past, and ultimately maybe not having to deal fully with what happened in the past.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to read you something from Barry's book. He writes that the failure of many negotiations has a similar cause. Because we tend to think of ourselves as occupying the golden mean, we tend to believe that when others say something, they mean what we would mean if we said that. So it's an interesting comment about this concept, it really relates to communication in the time of these difficult situations that mediators find themselves in. Anyone want to comment further on this before we move on? If
yes,
not,
sorry to interrupt you. Hi, Shelley McKnight. I really find this an excellent point, and we are talking about theory, but very practical. And we just wrestled with this yesterday on a file that had a human rights aspect, as well as my video on so you can see me, as well as a workers' compensation, and it was an arbitration, in arbitration as well.
Well, not to interrupt you, can you just tell me, were you a representative in that matter, or what was your role?
My role was after the fact. We were talking about how conflict and why this person couldn't settle it, even though it was what they wanted. So my role was in the workers' compensation part of it, actually, but as an advisor to that. And it was a debrief on a file. So that was my role, but and then it comes up, and I thought, well, this comes up a lot. And of course, what you have said, and I think the science of settlement is very important, and I'm going to take that back. We'll take that back, sorry, to my company, and why we are stuck, because we're far too much in the technical. And they thought it was a great settlement. I'm thinking it was a great settlement, but yes, that happens a lot. The employee can't let go, and we need to work with that. So thank you very much. Sorry, I'm talking quite a bit, but thank you very much. It was a very important point to all of you, not just, and yes, there's some excellent points in everything, but that was the takeaway for me. I know we're not finished yet, but it's my big takeaway. Thank you.
Let me add something, because it's helped me a lot. And when I get that resistance, I have a little speech that I give, and I put it in the book, and it goes something. I'll exaggerate to make the point, but it says, you know, Madam Grievant, I'm really happy to be doing business with you, because I can see that you are a responsible grown-up adult. I sometimes have grievants who are not responsible grown-up adults, and you know what happens? They fall in love with their lawsuits or their grievances, and then when it's time to settle, they can't do that. But I can see that you have more going on in your life than just this lawsuit, and you're not the kind of person that has these unrealistic pie in the sky ideas, and you're the kind of person, a grown-up, mature adult who understands that it's time to move on, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you. It's hard for them to say, no, I'm not at all. I am ridiculous, and I am in love with my lawsuit. So I offer that for your consideration too.
Barry has another approach too. I don't know if you're going to tell us about this at some point, but Barry has a badge.
Oh, I do. I'm never far away from my badge. It's over here.
I guess you would bring this out if the person that you were describing said, well, no, in fact, I am in love with my lawsuit. And I know it's worth millions of dollars. And so that this is the point that Barry pulls out his badge.
Here's my badge, and it has my name on it, and it says my many degrees, Barry Goldman, MAJD, Agent of Reality. Look, I'm here on behalf of reality. This is the best. Take the deal.
Thank you. So we'll move on then to the next concept, and Barry has foreshadowed it in terms of his description of how he would frame the dispute to a reluctant grievor. So framing, do you want to describe this concept for us, Barry?
It's a very broad concept. The idea is that the way that you ask a question is going to have an effect on the kinds of answers that you get. Framing of the question determines, to some degree, the kind of answer you're going to get. So here's an example, and we're going to bring up another poll. Let me tell the story. You're buying a wallet, very nice wallet, at the wallet store. It costs $100. And you are standing at the cash register, and you're about to hand your credit card to the clerk to buy your brand new $100 wallet. And Jules Bloch comes up to you and says, you know, I see you're about to buy this wallet for $100. Do you know that if you walk 2 blocks to the other store across the street there, you can get precisely that same wallet for $75. You can save $25 by walking 2 blocks. Can we bring up the poll here? Would you walk 2 blocks to save $25 on the wallet? Would you answer that question, please, everybody?
The second question you got to deal with too. It's also part of the poll. Barry.
Yes, I will talk about that in a minute. All right. Second question, you're at the furniture store, you're about to buy a leather couch, costs $1,000, and Jules comes up to you and says, You know, that same couch is available down the street, 2 blocks away. If you walk 2 blocks, you can save $25 on that couch. It'll only cost you $975. Would you walk the 2 blocks? Okay, answer that question, and then can we display the answers to everybody?
We have about 9 people, 10 people that have answered.
Go ahead then.
Okay.
Okay. See? Here's what I mean about framing, and finally we got an example that works. $25, friends, is $25. 2 blocks is 2 blocks. You are you. Everything that matters in this example is the same, but we get 2 very different answers. All of you would walk the 2 blocks to save $25 on the wallet, and not all of you would do it on the couch. And I get answers like, well, you know, it's only 2.5% discount. Well, and it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant to whether you do it. But even if you have money to burn and you don't care about $25, you can see, I think, it's easier to walk the 2 blocks in case number 1 than it is in case number 2. In case number 2, 25, though that stack of 25 singles is negligible. The exactly equivalent stack of 25 singles in the first case is substantial. They are exactly mathematically and logically and every other way equivalent, but they are not psychologically equivalent. That's what framing is about. And we proved it, even in this sophisticated audience. Congratulations. Next question, another framing question. Thank you for coming to our session this afternoon. We, but unfortunately, is the first question is, yeah, we didn't have enough money to pay the participants. We're in the hole, and we're asking everybody before they leave to please give us $20. So, sorry, but you know, reasons. So everybody has to give us $20. But we're gonna make it fair. If you don't wanna give us $20, you really object to doing that, we're gonna flip a coin, fair coin, suppose it's really fair and you can really trust me, and I'm gonna flip a fair coin and you call it, heads or tails. If you win, you don't have to pay anything. But if you lose, you have to pay us $40. So double or nothing on the way out the door. Do you pay the $20 or do you flip a coin 50-50 and take the risk that you might have to pay $40? That's the first question. Please answer the first question. Pay the money, flip the coin. Second question. We have extra money, different case. Forget what I just told you. Now it's a different case. We have extra money. We didn't have to, nobody had to fly to Toronto. We have extra money. We're going to give everybody $20. On your way out of the door, you get $20, okay? Or, just so it's symmetrical, we can flip that fair coin and you can, if you win, you call it, and if you win, you get $40. But if you lose, you get nothing. Do you take the 20 or do you flip the coin? That's question 2. Please answer question 2.
We have about 8 out of 11 that have voted.
It's not as dramatic as I would like, but you go ahead and display that to everybody. The principle that we're trying to show, and I can pretty confidently predict that we would show it if we had a larger number of participants, but it shows up here, is that people are inclined, that losses loom larger than gains. I don't like to take a loss. I don't like to take a loss. And rather than take a loss, I will take a gamble. I'll do the flip rather than take a sure loss. Gains, however, are different. In what they call a gain frame, this is a exercise about framing. In a gain frame, take the money. Sure thing, take the money. In a loss frame, take the risk. And I think we showed that a little bit in this example. If they're the same. It's a 50-50 chance on a $20 bet. That's what it is. They're exactly equivalent, unless you're a very poor person, you don't have $20. That's a different case. But in general, it's a 50-50 bet on a $20 proposition. But they're not psychologically equivalent because one of them is a gain and one of them is a loss. Gentlemen.
Well, I thought I would want to talk about something that I think demonstrates this in real life and has happened during our lifetime. So I always found it fascinating. I'm originally a Quebecer that the Parti Québécois always took the yes side in do you want sovereignty association? Do you want to separate? And by choosing the yes side, they received a few percentage points more as it goes than they would have. So they framed the question in a way where they get the benefit of being on the yes side. Now we look at Brexit, and for some reason the party in power decided to take the no side. Would you like to leave the European Union? And they took the side that guarantees you a percentage less than the yes side. And as you know, with Brexit, it ended up being a very, very close vote. And there's articles about had the Conservatives taken the yes side, they may have won that vote. So they had complete control over the question, the framing of the question. And in the Brexit context, the party in power who had the ability to decide the framing misplayed that. And in Quebec, the Parti Québécois always played it properly, always took the yes side on that. So I think that's an interesting example about what happens if you don't frame something properly. And in mediating, you get to, at the end of the day, you get to frame. When you speak with the griever, because at the end of the day, in something that it's often the griever who refuses to settle, even though the union thinks it's a good deal, and the employer, obviously, who made the proposal thinks it's a good deal, and you get to figure out how to speak to a griever. And it's very important to figure out how to frame the offer. And in framing that offer in the most positive way possible, you have a greater likelihood of getting the griever to agree to what you as a mediator, having evaluated the offer, the option, think is a good option for the griever.
Thanks, Jules. Chris?
I don't know if you know the book Nudge. It has some very good examples of framing.
I'm sorry, what's the book?
Nudge, it's
No,
called. And it's to do with really people who determine public policy, and that the framing should, as far as possible, be the most socially desirable framing. And they give two quite good examples. One is the issue of organ donations. So if the default is, it's framed that you've got to opt in order to give your organs when you die, you get very relatively little participation, and you have a problem in that society of a shortage of organs that are needed for people who need them. And in a country like Portugal, for example, opted the other route. They framed it differently. The framing was that you do donate your organs if you die, unless you opt out of it. And so the opt-out has meant that, and the other feature in Portugal is that if you opt out and there's any shortage of organs, you go to the bottom of the queue if you had opted out. So the result is they have no problems of organ shortage in Portugal. So that's a way, and I mean, there are other socially valuable ones. For example, pensions, that rather than having the default as people get pensions rather than payouts of their money when they reach the age of retirement. And similarly, as Jules says, in reframing it in negotiations or mediations, and to use some of these examples, I mean, really the difference between the couch example and the wallet example is really the percentage difference is what influenced us. And often the switch from the actual money to the percentages can be useful in reaching an agreement one way or the other.
Thank you, Chris. Rick Charney has just pointed out that this is what cable TV companies call negative option billing.
Right.
Any other comments before we move on to the next session? I don't see any. I just did want to make a point. Our time is good. I was thinking about the difference in opinion between Jules and Chris about who should make the offer first. And reminded me of something that Barry has written about in his book, and it relates to the winner's curse. And one of the points that Barry makes after, Barry, do you want to explain that concept briefly?
Winner's curse. Somebody said, if you wanna ruin somebody's day, take his first offer. That's the sums up the winner's curse. I'm walking down the street. I see you got this thing for sale. I say, I'll give you $10 for that thing. And the guy says, sold, and sticks out his hand. You ruined his day. Take his first offer. He has the winner's curse. A minute ago, I thought that $10 for that I was prepared to go to 20, but you took my 10. Now I don't want the thing, and every time I look at it for the rest of my life, I'm going to remember that I overpaid for it. I got what I wanted at a price I said I was willing to pay, and I hate the thing, and it bothers me for the rest of my life. That's the winner's curse.
Thanks, Barry. And one of the comments that Barry makes in his book about this is that the really good negotiator doesn't let his opponent get the winner's curse. He adjusts his target range to allow his opponent to fully participate in the process and achieve a satisfactory result. So it's an interesting concept and an interesting practical point that Barry makes. So we are now going to move on to our next concept, the availability heuristic. Barry, do you want to explain that?
Sure. If I ask you, how many homicides are there every year in Michigan? I get an answer. I get some kind of an answer. And if I ask you, how many homicides are there a year in Detroit? I get another answer. Yeah, in Michigan, what happens? I say, how many homicides do you think there are in Michigan in a year? You say, Michigan. It's a woodsy, green place with a lot of lakes, right? Cold. How many homicides? 30, maybe, some drunken hunters. How many homicides a year do you think there are in Detroit? Detroit, 300? Can't be, right? Detroit is in Michigan. It can't have more homicides than the state does. But that's not how the brain works. That's not how the mind works. This is called the availability heuristic, because you look in your brain and you say, what do I know about this context? What do I know about Michigan? What do I know about Michigan? And we think that what occurs to us, what's available in our memory, reflects what's true about the world. Another example, if I say to you, what percentage of the house work do you do in your house? What percentage of the household chores do you personally perform? Write that number down. And then go around to the other people in your household and ask them the same question and ask them to write down their numbers and gather them all together and add them up. And I am confident that total will be more than 100%. Because what's available to me in my memory is my memory of me doing, mopping the floor and cleaning up after the dog hair and the cat hair and the rest of the damn hair around here. When you do it, it's not in my memory. It doesn't take up any space at all. And the availability heuristic is the mistake that we all make of believing that what's available to me in my head is an accurate reflection of what's true about the world. Gentlemen.
Okay, so many of these concepts are about personal views on things. And the way to get someone past their personal view or the last thing they remembered or their own perception is through facts, is through showing demonstrably why your view doesn't work and why you can never get what you want. My favorite in a practical setting is human rights and American television. So many of the grievers or people who have human rights claims, we're inundated with American culture. Most of the world is inundated with American culture, but we certainly are, being up here in the frozen north. And in the United States, there are huge sums of money that are awarded to breaches of human rights. And grievers come with that in mind when they want to put on the table what they expect from the process. And you need to figure out how to deal with the griever in a way to understand that in our world, our human rights awards are significantly smaller. And you basically have to do that through them buying into your ability to neutrally evaluate the case before you. That on these facts, these are the potential outcomes or the range of outcomes. And you have to sometimes you have to show them the case law on that and to juxtapose it to the case law they believe exists in the United States. And for employers, it's interesting, especially in employment law, that Americans have right to work states, and they actually don't have a lot of the common law that we accept in Canada doesn't work in the United States. So in Canada, we reward people on the basis of seniority, and your notice period is based on how long you've been in a job and how long will it take you to find a similar job. And that doesn't exist in the United States. But however, much of the Canadian economy is owned by American companies. We're subsidiaries of American companies. And often you get the counsel from Texas who thinks you've lost your minds up here. And I have a routine about that. I've just used it recently. And I look at the counsel, often on a telephone, because they don't want to fly to Toronto. And I say, sir, we have a different way of going about things. And obviously they say, you guys are communists. And I say, yes, sir, we are. We have your conservative communists, we have your liberal communists, and we have your new democratic communists. But the point is, we have a different political culture, and we've made different choices as a society. You pay a lot of money to people whose rights, human rights have been affected, age discrimination, and we pay money for a longevity in a job. And you just have to buy into how we do business, because this is our country, and we buy into how you do business when we're visiting your country. And that often breaks the ice, and you're able to get a deal at that point.
My points are very similar to Jules's. I mean, it's really, how do you, the issue that Barry's identified is the tendency to mistake the available for the most relevant. And so I think one useful thing is to, if you get a proposal which really seems wrong in some way, is to find out the source of their evaluation. How did you evaluate that? How did you come to that idea? What's the source of that? Why do you think that's the appropriate amount? Or what tells you that's the appropriate amount? Did you see it somewhere, or it's from some decision, or what? And then to try and get the discussion onto what are the relevant precedents and the relevant determinants of how this particular dispute is likely to be resolved. It strikes me that's an approach similar to what Jules was saying.
Chris. Now those are the concepts that we wanted to discuss today. Any questions in relation to that concept, the availability heuristic, first of all? Comments or questions with respect to that?
Just one more thing I wanted to say about an earlier concept, which was the framing, you know, and not the framing, the endowment effect. People often are very attached to their ideas as to how to resolve an issue. And the notion of giving ownership to them over the idea of what's happening is sometimes useful, so that if one takes an idea that somebody has proposed and say, look, it has a lot of potential, let's work with it, that gets a kind of a buy-in from them, even if what you're aiming to do is to change it around a bit and to make additional proposals and alter it. They've got it in their minds that that's their idea that's being developed, and that often is useful to be able to use that notion of anchoring.
Barry, you talk about the certainty effect. Does that concept have any role to play in an understanding of what we've just discussed?
I could explain what the certainty effect is, but I don't immediately see the connection.
Why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, if I the famous experiment has to do with an imaginary disease and an imaginary drug, and if I can cure 100% of the cases, that's a much better drug. Here's how it works. Let's see. I've got this drug that cures half the people of this disease that affects 100 million people. I've got a drug that will cure half of them. I've got another drug that will cure 100% of the people, but it's a disease that only affects a tiny number of people. Which one do you like better? Which one do you want to invest in? And people will invest in the one that has 100% effect. People like certainty. They don't like risk. We are risk averse. And I will pay money. I will invest. I will make decisions on the basis of if I can be sure. Better example. How much would you pay to reduce your risk? Let's take COVID. How much would you pay to reduce your risk of COVID from 10% risk to a 9% risk of getting it in the next 6 months? And people will give you an answer, some dollar number. How much would you pay to reduce it from 100% risk to a 99% risk? The idea of certainty blows the whole question out of the water. If you can reduce it, 1%, a 1% risk is a 1% risk, right? Logically speaking, from 1% to 0% is the most important one. We're talking about getting a disease. I'll pay anything to reduce my risk from 1% to 0%. I'll pay hardly anything to reduce it from 87 to 86. That 1%, it depends where that 1% falls in the spectrum. The one from 99 to 100, that's a very important one. And the one from 1 to 0, that's very important. The rest of them are not at all important. By orders of magnitude, that's the certainty effect.
Thank you for explaining that, Barry. And I was thinking
Took
of
me
it.
3 tries, but I okay.
I was thinking of it in the context of what sells in mediation, and one of the arrows that we have, one of the most, I think, effective places of persuasion is the certainty that we're able to sell in a settlement, right? You talk about the risk of litigation, the uncertainty, the time, but when you sign off on a settlement, and this is, as I said, I think quite often the persuasive point for a grievor is you can leave this behind. You can walk out today and have X, Y, and Z and know that it's over. And I do think it's one of our most valuable tools as mediators.
I wanted to back into Susan. I think Susan, I think you're correct, and I see. I think that's very important. But I always like to think about deals that you have but don't get signed off, and this links into what Susan was saying. And I see that as a combination of regret aversion and regret aversion and status quo. And we didn't really discuss status quo, but what you're doing when you're trying to affect the deal is you're changing people's status quo. And when you get to the point of you actually get them to agree to a new status quo, and they basically agree, but you haven't written up the minutes of settlement and it hasn't been signed off. And so people leave that room not having finished the process. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go back the next day and start from scratch because you've never really affected the new status quo. They retrench back into their old status quo, what the positions were prior to trying to affect the deal. And also there's the regret aversion because you haven't created the new status quo and people are still living in their old reality. They are averse to the new reality, and they were worried about regretting the new reality. So I think Susan's point about certainty links up with this, that it's always my practice never to let people leave a room unless they've signed on the dotted line.
You have to capture the momentum.
Yeah, and I want to thank Barry for making me think about, like, a lot of us as mediators, as practitioners, do a whole bunch of things without ever naming what we do or understanding the names. And what Barry's done, what I find really helpful about Barry's book, is he is able to name situations that we're in all the time. And by naming them, it allows you to have the dialogue. And so thank you, Barry, for helping me put names to the things I do or think about.
And Jules, your comment makes me think about something that a reviewer has said on the front cover of Barry's book. This reviewer says that Goldman has combined the latest scientific research with an everyday common sense approach to decision making. His summaries of complex psychological and economic principles are superb. His conversational prose and excellent use of examples make the science memorable and easy to apply. The book is a must-read for any lawyer or mediator. Chris, do you have any comments?
Nothing more. Yeah, thank you, Susan.
We have 5 minutes left. Any comments from the audience? Well, I think that perhaps, Barry, anything final from you?
The conversation about don't let them out of the room until they've signed the document reminds me. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I was a baby mediator, and there was a court report. It started out as an arbitration, and and that she was a much more seasoned professional than I was. And she told me later, never let the turkeys out of the box. And that's very useful motto. Don't let the turkeys out of the box. That's not, if you take nothing else away from this session, I found it very useful.
And you've inspired Chris to make a comment.
Just one more comment. Shannon's raised a good question in the chat, which is really, we've mostly been talking about money and much less about the emotional affect of some of these experiences that people have in the disputes. And I think she makes a very good point, which is that as part of any resolution, you're not just coming to a result, you're also trying to address the hurt and to vindicate the person, to vindicate their having brought this forward and have had the courage to take it up and address the issues that have been bothering them. I think part of the emotional healing that's mentioned, I mean, it's not directly related to some of these things, but it is part of, in a way it is. I mean, it's to do with what people bring to it. What's part of the endowment is a great deal of feelings associated with the issue, not just the money. I mean, I know it's frustrating for a mediator where you've come with a good proposal and the person's response is, you know, I'm not really doing this for myself, I'm doing it for everybody else out there, and I'm saving them for afterwards. And I mean, although one's natural reaction is that there's something disingenuous about that, I think you've got to try and address that feeling of that there's something more than just the money involved for this person, you know.
And there always are options other than money too in a settlement. I mean, you can be creative and look at other options, which might include non-monetary options. Jules, you had a comment.
Well, two things. One, the systems that we're in, where there's grievance arbitration or court cases, aren't very helpful to trying to find catharsis for an individual grievant or grievor, as we say in Canada. And so you've really got to be creative to help a griever gain some emotional satisfaction. But I've noticed over time that if you're able to switch the paradigm and find a solution that isn't based on what the money the griever was asking for or the employer's reaction, but find another answer, that seems to be A, unexpected, and B, seems to be put the griever in a position where they're saying, I understand the money, but this is actually what I wanted. The system itself is built on the premise of not giving me this, nor could I ask for this. But since this is now on offer, this is better than money. And it's very rare, I mean, that happens. For instance, an apology, which is not something the system really gives, but if you're able to figure out that what the griever really wanted was an apology and the money was the only way to justify the situation, because that's how our system works, and you're able to identify that, they might very well accept that as what they really wanted. They're unusual situations, and you often not based on what you could give them as an arbitrator or what the court systems could give.
Yeah, just one more comment. You know, in the study group for dispute resolution, ILERA study group, we got country reports from the different countries, brief summaries of developments in dispute resolution. And I was interested in the Japanese report about labor relations developments there. The shift in the nature of the disputes, that a much higher percentage of the disputes are to do with harassment claims and claims of bullying and maltreatment, rather than claims about unfair discipline or claims about money and so forth. So, and I think that's true of our work too. I think we're seeing much higher elements of injury to dignity, way people are treated, bullying, those kinds of issues, harassment. And I think the issue of dealing with how to vindicate the person other than with money is an important feature of our continuing work, and an increasing feature.
And of course, the beauty of the mediation process is that all options are potentially possible. And there are resolutions available in mediation that would not necessarily be available if the matter proceeded to its conclusion in litigation. So we are at the end of our time. So I think we will conclude, but I'd just like to ask the panelists to remain on the call just for a couple of moments. But if everyone else wouldn't mind departing, I'd like to thank you very much. You weren't a big audience, but you were a lovely audience. So, so thank you very much for participating today. Take care and be well, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks.